The crimson silk of my wedding gown felt less like a garment and more like a shroud as I stood before the iron-wrought mirrors of the royal dressing suite. My handmaidens worked in a frantic, terrifying silence, weaving my blonde hair into braids so tight they felt like golden chains anchoring me to a fate I hadn't chosen. Beyond the heavy oak doors, the grand halls of the palace hummed with the opulence of a celebration, but within these walls, there was only the suffocating scent of lilies and the cold dread of the sacrificial queen. I was a commodity, an omega sold to settle a debt, destined for a monarch of ice who supposedly withered everything he touched. When the doors finally groaned open, the throne room was a blur of gold and judgment. There stood King Raoul, his presence a mountain of granite topped by a crown that looked more like a weapon than jewelry. He didn't look at me with warmth. His eyes were chips of winter frost, adhering strictly to the lethal prophecy that had kept him isolated for years. The ceremony was a hollow blur of ancient vows until the moment arrived for the public contractual kiss. It was meant to be a mere formality, a cold sealing of a transaction. As he leaned in, the scent of cedar and old power filled my senses. The moment our lips met, the world didn't just stop. It shattered. A violent, white-hot soul spark ignited at the point of contact. A dormant, ancient bond screaming to life between a virgin omega and a stone king. The shockwave pulsed through the marrow of my bones, and for the first time, I saw the ice in Raoul's eyes crack, replaced by a raw, terrifying hunger. We broke apart, gasping, as the court fell into a stunned, deathly silence. The contract was sealed, but as I looked at the trembling hands of my king, I realized that the kiss hadn't just finished a wedding. It had started a war against the very prophecy that defined us. Raoul's private chambers were a fortress of shadows and silent history, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and the residual heat of the soul spark that still thrummed in my veins. As I moved deeper into the royal wing, I felt less like a bride and more like a ghost haunting the halls of a man who preferred the company of stone. He remained a distance away, his movements rigid, as if he feared that a single touch would reignite the fire that had nearly brought us both to our knees in the throne room. I stopped before a heavy velvet curtain, pulling it back to reveal a gallery hidden from the rest of the world. It was not a collection of trophies or weapons, but rows of delicate, vibrant paintings and charcoal sketches. My fingers brushed the edge of a canvas depicting a sunrise over the jagged peaks of our territory, the colors so full of longing that my breath hitched. This was the soul Raoul hid behind his crown, a man who saw the world in shades of beauty while the world saw him only in shades of blood. "Touch nothing," his voice rasped from the doorway, though the command lacked its usual bite. I turned to find him watching me, the golden crown casting a jagged shadow across his face. In the dim light, the king of stone looked fragile. The bond whispered a truth he refused to speak. He wasn't a monster born of ice, but a prisoner of the very prophecy that had sold me to him. "You painted these," I whispered, stepping toward him. He flinched as if I had struck him, his pupils dilating as the spark between us flared in recognition. I realized then that the marriage bed wasn't the most dangerous place in this palace. It was this room, where the mask of the Alpha King fell away to reveal a man who was just as terrified of his own heart as I was of my future. The sanctuary of the gallery was soon invaded by the cold reality of the palace's political rot. By the next morning, the intoxicating glow of the soul spark was eclipsed by the poisonous murmurs that drifted through the stone corridors like a foul draft. While Raoul retreated into the icy silence of his duties, I found myself cornered in the solarium by the older women of the court, the withered widows, who served as the grand advisor's eyes and ears. Their voices were like dry leaves scraping against pavement as they spoke of the death bloom prophecy. They whispered of the 3 queens who had come before me, Women who had allegedly entered these halls with glowing skin, only to be found as husks of bone within a year. "The Alpha's love is a toxin," one hissed, her eyes fixed on the red silk of my sleeves, as if she could already see the rot setting in. "The more he desires you, the faster the prophecy will drink your life force until there is nothing left but ash." I felt a chill that no fireplace could warm. I looked at my hands, still tingling from where Raoul had brushed against them, and wondered if my growing affection for the king was actually a death sentence. Every time the bond pulled at my heart, I saw the faces of the dead queens in my mind. The fear began to take root, twisting the beautiful spark into a source of agony. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my place in the kingdom. I was fighting for my very survival against a curse that claimed my heart was my greatest enemy. The heavy silence of the palace became a weapon, as Raoul began to build a wall of ice between us. He stopped visiting the gallery, and the meals we once shared in a tense but intimate quiet were now served to me alone in the vast dining hall. Through the soul spark, I could feel his agonizing proximity, a low, thrumming heat that vibrated through the walls. But whenever our paths crossed in the corridors, his gaze remained fixed on the floor, his jaw set in a line of granite. He was a shadow in his own home, moving with a haunted grace that screamed of a man trying to outrun his own heart. The rejection stung more than the widow's whispers. One evening, I found him standing on the battlements, his cape billowing like a dark cloud against the moon. When I reached out to touch his arm, he recoiled as if my skin were branding iron. "Stay away, Doris," he growled, the vibration of his voice rattling my ribcage. "Every step you take toward me is a step toward your grave. I will not be the cause of your light flickering out." He was trying to protect me by starving the bond, unaware that the distance was creating its own kind of rot. The Alpha's shadow loomed over every interaction, turning my sanctuary into a cell. I realized that Raoul was fighting a war on two fronts, against the conspirators who wanted his throne and against the love he believed would kill me. By pushing me into the dark, he thought he was preserving my life, but he was only making it easier for the shadows in the palace to close in. The more he withdrew to save me, the more vulnerable I became to the very enemies he thought his coldness could keep at bay. Grand Advisor Silas appeared in the garden like a vulture circling a dying beast, his robes sweeping over the frost-nipped grass as he approached my bench. He didn't wait for an invitation, his presence cold and calculated as he sat beside me, his eyes gleaming with a sympathy that felt as sharp as a blade. "The king's distance is not a choice, my queen, but a mercy," he whispered, his voice smooth and dripping with fabricated concern. He spoke of the prophecy as an absolute law, painting Raoul not as a protector, but as a predator who was currently using my virgin soul to fuel his own waning vitality. "He knows that the soul spark is a leech," Silas continued, leaning in close enough for me to smell the stale scent of incense. "He is pushing you away because he cannot bear to watch the light leave your eyes as he drinks it to maintain his crown." Every word was a needle intended to puncture the fragile trust I had built in Raoul. Silas claimed that Raoul had married me not to settle a debt, but because a Virgin Omega was the only thing capable of temporarily stalling the withered fate that awaited him. I looked down at the ring on my finger, the heavy gold feeling like a shackle. The advisor's web was intricate, weaving my fear of the widow's whispers with Raoul's cold rejection to create a tapestry of betrayal. I wanted to scream that he was lying, but the logic felt sound in my terrified mind. Why else would a king who claimed to want my safety treat me like a plague? Silas left me there among the dying flowers, successfully planting a seed of doubt that threatened to choke the soul spark before it could ever become a flame. The heavy pretense of the last few days broke when Raoul summoned me to the great library, not as a husband, but as a king. He stood before a tattered map of our ancestors, his crown discarded on a side table as if the weight had finally become unbearable. "There is a history they don't teach the Omegas," he began, his voice devoid of its usual gravelly command. He spoke of the ancient pack, of how the Alpha King's strength was never meant to be a solitary burden but a shared fire. As he traced the lines of the territory, he confessed the true source of his terror. The prophecy had claimed his father's heart, and he had spent every moment since his coronation convinced that his own pulse was a ticking clock for anyone he held dear. In that dim light, the Stone King finally cracked. He looked at me, his forest green eyes shimmering with a raw vulnerability that no advisor could fabricate. He admitted that the more the soul spark pulled us together, the more he felt he was failing me. "I was told my love was a rot, Doris," he whispered, his hand hovering inches from mine, trembling. "But when I saw you in the throne room, I didn't feel death. I felt a beginning." It was a lesson in power that had nothing to do with crowns or armies. I realized then that Raoul wasn't my predator. He was a victim of the same fear that Silas was using to keep me small. The Omega shame that had defined my life, the idea that I was merely a commodity to be used, mirrored his own belief that he was a curse to be endured. As we stood in the silence of the library, the bond between us hummed with a new, dangerous clarity. The prophecy wasn't a law of nature. It was a prison of the mind, and for the first time, I saw the key in the way he looked at me, not as a sacrifice, but as his equal. The palace was transformed for the midnight masquerade, a whirlwind of lace, velvet, and hidden faces that masked the growing rot within the court. Despite the lingering doubt Silas had sown, I dressed with a new sense of purpose, my blonde hair no longer feeling like a chain, but a crown of my own making. Beneath the music and the laughter of the aristocracy, the air was thick with the scent of ozone. The soul spark was reacting to a hidden threat. I used the cover of the festivities to slip into the Grand Advisor's private sanctum, my heart hammering against my ribs. Among the stacks of forbidden scrolls and dark artifacts, I found it. A hidden journal bound in the same leather as the royal archives. As I turned the yellowed pages, the truth fell into place with the cold finality of a closing tomb. The Death Bloom prophecy was a masterpiece of fiction, meticulously tampered with by Silas himself generations ago to ensure every Alpha King remained isolated, terrified, and dependent on the advisor's guidance. The previous queens hadn't withered from Raoul's love. They had been systematically poisoned with slow-acting silver dust. I gasped, clutching the book to my chest as the image of the previous queen's husks took on a much more sinister meaning. Just as I turned to flee and warn Raoul, the door creaked open. Silas stood there, his ceremonial mask a twisted, smiling thing of porcelain. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked ready. The trap had been set long before I ever entered the garden, and as the masquerade reached its crescendo outside, I realized that the true mask had finally been removed. Silas moved with a speed that belied his age, his hand clamping over my mouth before I could draw a breath to scream. The journal was ripped from my grasp, falling to the stone floor with a dull thud that sounded like a funeral knell. "A clever little Omega," he hissed, his eyes glinting with a feral malice that finally matched his soul. "But knowledge is a heavy burden for one so fragile." He signaled to the shadows, and 2 guards clad in silver-embroidered tunics emerged, their faces obscured by the grotesque masks of the masquerade. I was dragged through a secret passage, the walls damp and smelling of ancient decay, until we reached a hidden chamber beneath the ballroom. The room was lined with raw silver ore, the air vibrating with a hum that made my wolf whimper in agony. In the center of the room, Raoul was already there, chained to a monolith of silver that drained the golden light from his skin. He looked up, his forest green eyes clouded with pain, his once mighty frame slumped under the weight of the dampening field. "Doris," he rasped, the sound tearing at my heart. Silas stepped into the center of the room, drawing a jagged ritual blade. "The prophecy must be fulfilled tonight," the advisor proclaimed, his voice echoing against the silver walls. "The king will watch his virgin bride wither, and in his grief, he will finally surrender the last of his will to me." He pressed the blade to my throat, the cold steel biting into my skin. I could feel the soul spark between Raoul and me thrashing against the silver's suppression, a desperate, dying flame. Raoul roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak, as he strained against his shackles until his wrists bled. The masquerade continued above us, the music a cruel irony to the blood that began to trickle down my collarbone. I realized then that my survival was no longer about a dead or a family name. It was the only thing standing between Raoul and a total, eternal darkness. The silver-lined walls hummed with a malevolent frequency, but as Silas pressed the blade against my throat, the terror in my heart transformed into a cold, diamond-hard clarity. I looked past the advisor's cruel smile and locked eyes with Raoul. Through the dampening field, the soul spark didn't just flicker, it roared, a bridge of pure energy that the silver could not touch because it wasn't born of magic, but of the soul. I realized then that my omega shame was the final lie I had to discard. I wasn't a victim or a commodity. I was the Alpha King's anchor. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I leaned into the blade, catching Silas off guard and lunged toward the monolith. I didn't reach for the chains. I reached for Raoul's face. My hands, stained with the small trickle of blood from my neck, cupped his jaw. I ignored the searing burn of the silver shackles against my arms and pressed my lips to his. This was the kiss of sovereignty. Not a ceremonial seal or a desperate goodbye, but a deliberate transfer of my own resilience into his fading core. The explosion of light was blinding. The soul spark, fed by my willingness to sacrifice everything, surged through Raoul like a tidal wave of molten gold. The silver monolith cracked, the dampening field shattering under the sheer pressure of a bond that had finally been fully claimed. Raoul's roar was no longer one of pain, but of a god reclaiming his throne. He snapped the silver chains like they were made of dry straw, his wolf's power erupting in a magnificent, terrifying display of golden aura. Silas fell back, his ritual blade clattering to the floor as the false prophecy was incinerated in the heat of our united spirits. I stood tall beside my king, no longer a sacrificial virgin, but the woman who had turned a stone king back into a man. The golden light of a new morning spilled through the high windows of the great hall, illuminating a palace that felt lighter, as if the very stones had been scrubbed of a century's worth of lies. Silas was led away in heavy irons, his destination the desolate wastelands, where his only company would be the silence of the power he had failed to steal. There was no need for a bloody execution. His greatest punishment was witnessing the birth of the era he had spent a lifetime trying to prevent. Raoul stood at the center of the hall, the jagged crown once again upon his brow, but it no longer looked like a weapon. He reached out, his hand steady and warm, and drew me to his side. The council members, once arrogant and dismissive, now knelt in a wave of velvet and steel, their heads bowed to a king who had found his heart and a queen who had found her voice. The omega shame that had once made me feel like a commodity was gone, replaced by the fierce, radiant pride of a Luna who had saved her people from within. Through the soul spark, I could feel Raoul's thoughts, a clear and constant melody of gratitude and unyielding love. We stepped out onto the royal balcony together, overlooking a territory that was no longer ruled by the fear of a false prophecy. The people below cheered, a sound like a rising tide, celebrating a union that had begun with a debt but ended with a destiny. We had been given a second chance, not just to rule, but to live. And as the sun rose higher, I knew that every kiss from this moment on would be a promise of a future we had fought to deserve.